Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 52nd deck and it is titled Maximum Security Prison. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we jump into today's deck tech, I do want to highlight some of our social media accounts. If you are interested, you can follow us over on Twitter, on Reddit, you can send us an email. And if you're interested in supporting our content directly, you can of course use our affiliate link with TCG Player, or you can head over to Patreon and give us a little bit of additional support over there as well. But right now, all of the money that we're getting from Patreon is going toward any supplies that we can use to try to film in-person games. And of course, there are some sweet rewards as well for the different tiers on the Patreon. Please do check that out. Otherwise, if none of these are quite your style, you can always like the video and subscribe. That does help out a lot, and I appreciate all of the support that we've been getting lately, so thank you very much. And then, of course, one last thing to do before we actually jump into the deck tech today, and that is to give a quick shout out. So recently, the Underground Sea has partnered up with our channel to start producing some small primer videos on some of our decks. And they just came out with the first one. That is our Dina Soul Steeper deck, which if you are interested is a phenomenal deck. I'm a big fan of it. And they did about a 10-minute video kind of just walking through the deck itself, talking a little bit about some of the cards and what makes it unique. Notably, this is a fully Italian YouTube channel, so if you don't speak the language, there are subtitles that they add to all of their videos because they are absolutely awesome content creators. So no matter what your style is in deck brewing, they've probably got a video out there for you. So I do highly recommend you check them out, and I wanted to say thank you and shout them out for giving our channel a little support as well. So with the introductions and the shout-outs out of the way, I think it is about time that we jump into our deck tech for the week. So our random card for this week was a suggested card by Matt Schroth on YouTube. This particular random card probably isn't going to be making a ton of friends, but it is definitely a unique card. So this week, we have Hokori Dust Drinker, 2 white for a legendary creature spirit. It's a 2/2. Lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player untaps a land he or she controls. So all lands, including ours, do not untap, and at the beginning of each player's turn, they get to untap one of their lands. So this is a universal effect, and obviously, as with all of our random cards that happen to be commanders, our commander is Hokori, so we are mono white this week, and we are going to be playing a bit of a Staxy style deck, and we're going to see how well we can do with stacks and tax, keeping it under $100. So that is our commander, and I've kind of already spoiled the first major theme of this deck, but in case you haven't guessed it already, it is going to be a stacks deck. So we want to tax what our opponents are doing, maybe make them pay a little bit extra, make sure they can't do anything too crazy. We are trying to level the playing field, which is especially important because we are playing mono white, which traditionally does not keep up with the other colors in terms of card draw and mana ramp. So we had to do something to kind of make it a little bit more even. So to represent our stacks theme, we have Archon of Emeria, which is 2 and a white for a 2/3 creature Archon. It's got flying, and each creature can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. Non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So limiting each opponent, well, in this case, each player, to only casting 1 spell each turn can be incredibly useful because we want to stop our opponents from maybe storming off. We want to stop the person who's got a ton of mana because they ramped early from casting a ton of things at once. This lets us level the playing field, which really is what this whole deck is about. There's a lot of effects in here that target everybody, not just our opponents, so we want to make sure that we are playing a nice, fair game of Magic. And then our second theme for this deck, because of the way that Hokori is worded, it specifically doesn't let players untap their lands. It never said anything about mana rocks, so we are loaded up with a ton of artifacts that tap for mana trying to make sure that when we stop lands from untapping, we still have something to use and something to play. So for an example, we have Hedron Archive, which is 4 mana for an artifact, taps for 2 colorless mana, or you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. So Hedron Archive, perfect. We want to add some mana, especially once we have Hokori on the board. And then if we get to the point where we don't really need it, we can sacrifice it, cash it in to get some cards. So this is definitely not the only mana rock that we have, but we do have quite a few in the hopes that we will be able to play the game and our opponents maybe won't be able to. So once we've leveled the playing field, then we need to give ourselves a little bit of an advantage. And then finally, our third theme in this deck is going to be making sure that we can protect ourselves. Now, I will be honest, the stuff that we are doing is probably going to make us a target. That tends to be how Stax and Tax decks work. So we want to make sure that even if our opponents can attack us, they might not be able to attack us with everything. So to that end, we have cards like Windborn Muse, which is 3 and a white for a creature spirit, 2/3 with flying. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. Now, Windborn Muse, definitely not the only card in here that does this, so we could probably stack it, maybe get 2, 4, 5 mana to attack us. That's kind of what we're aiming to do. We want to make it so that our opponents maybe can attack us, but it's really not in their best interest to do so because they may just have to take off their whole turn to send 1 or 2 creatures at us. So we're going to level the playing field, we're going to put ourselves a little bit ahead of everybody else, and then make sure that once we've kind of annoyed everybody else at the table, they can't really come our way. So those are the themes for our deck this week. And the next thing that we'll have to do is take a look at some key cards, the cards that we would love to have in play if we could. So the first of those is Spirit of the Labyrinth, 1 and a white for a 3/1 enchantment creature spirit. Each player can't draw more than 1 card each turn. Normally, this would be a massive downside, but considering we don't draw too many cards in this deck anyway, because we are mono white, we're not really set up to draw cards. If we can limit what everyone else is doing, this is going to put us in a much better situation, because we are equipped to handle only drawing 1 card a turn, or only playing 1 spell a turn. So whenever we can limit what everyone else is doing, kind of throw off their game plans while still sticking to ours, that's pretty much a win in our books. So Spirit of the Labyrinth is awesome for this deck because it really prevents our opponents from, well, hopefully prevents our opponents from drawing into answers. We can't really stop top decks. So Spirit of the Labyrinth, good at what it does and great in this deck. And then our second key card is Oswald Fiddlebender, which looks a little bit weird in this deck because it is 1 and a white for a legendary creature gnome artificer. He's a 2/2, and he has magical tinkering, so you can pay a white, tap him, sacrifice an artifact, and search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed artifact's mana value, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So we're not really an artifact deck, so it's weird that we would have Oswald Fiddlebender in the deck, let alone as a key card in the deck. But because we're playing so many mana rocks and so many artifacts that tap for mana because of our commander, Oswald lets us kind of move up the chain. We can play something small like a 2-mana Mind Stone, sacrifice it to get something that costs 3, and then up to 4 and 5, and our most expensive artifact costs 6. So there is a world in which we just go 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, but most of the time that's not going to be the case. It is nice though to sacrifice a mana rock that maybe taps for 1 or even just 1 colorless mana and get something that taps for 2 or maybe even 2 colored mana. So Oswald is perfect for what we're trying to do here, and he does look a little out of place, but believe it or not, he definitely overperforms in this deck, especially once Hokori hits the board. And then our third key card is going to be Approach of the Second Sun. We need a win condition in this deck, and Approach is by far the easiest one for us to pull off. So what it says is, well, I guess we should start with its mana cost. Approach of the Second Sun is 6 and a white, so a massive 7 mana sorcery. that says if Approach of the Second Sun was cast from your hand, and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun into its owner's library 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. So it's a bit weird because it does require us to cast it and then draw 7 cards and cast it again, which is going to be unlikely for a mono white deck. But keep in mind, we are trying to lock down the game. We want to prevent anyone from casting more than 1 spell a turn, drawing more than 1 card a turn, and hopefully even taxing our opponents to the point where their just cheap spells cost 3 or 4 more mana to cast. So the idea here is we can effectively shut down the board, cast Approach of the Second Sun, and safely survive until we're able to draw 7 cards and cast it again, because our opponents aren't going to be able to do anything to interact, to deal with us, or to stop us from winning the game right there. So Approach of the Second Sun is a phenomenal card in here, even though we're not drawing a ton of cards. It does what we want, and with all of our mana rocks, we're definitely able to ramp into it if that is our goal as well. So a great win condition for a deck that doesn't have a ton of creatures that can do damage. But those are our key cards for the week. So the next piece of this is to take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that work super well together. And the first of these cool interactions is going to be between Emeria Shepherd and Knight of the White Orchid. So Emeria Shepherd is 5 white for a 4/4 creature angel. She has flying and landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, and if that land is a plains, you may return that non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead. So very good, reanimates things, and since we're a mono white deck, we do have a ton of plains, so usually whatever we return will go to the battlefield. And if we partner that up with Knight of the White Orchid, which is white for a creature human knight 2/2 first strike, when Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So if we are able to pair these up successfully, we can very easily have Emeria Shepherd on the board. Maybe we played Knight of the White Orchid earlier, it died, we had to get it back at some point. So we play a plains, trigger Emeria Shepherd, get Knight of the White Orchid out of the graveyard. If an opponent has more lands than us, we get a plains, we put it into the battlefield, we get something else out of our graveyard with Emeria Shepherd. As long as an opponent has more lands than us, these 2 cards combined will always get us 2 cards out of the graveyard. Even if we just play Knight of the White Orchid, get a plains, and then play a plains from our hand, we will always get 2 out of the graveyard as long as an opponent has more lands in play. So not always going to work, but again, we are mono white. We don't ramp super well, so there's a very good chance that someone playing green at the table has more lands than us, and we can use this kind of to our benefit. And then our next cool interaction is between God Pharaoh's Statue and Mana Tithe. So God Pharaoh's Statue is our 6 mana artifact. It's the only one in the deck. And it says spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life. So again, kind of a win condition, but it is very slow, so I wouldn't count on that. The important piece of this is that it makes spells our opponents cast cost 2 more. And if we partner that up with Mana Tithe, which is 1 white for an instant, that says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. We have a ton of other cards that could fit in God Pharaoh Statue's place for this cool interaction, but we picked God Pharaoh Statue because it does make the cost 2 more. The idea here is that if we can kind of tax our opponent's spells, make the things that they're casting cost 2 or 3, 4 more maybe, that makes Mana Tithe significantly better because they will have to tap all their mana just to cast one thing, and then we can kind of get them with Mana Tithe. And even if our opponents know that we have Mana Tithe, or maybe even just think that we have Mana Tithe, and they're playing around it, that essentially just makes it cost 1 more anyway because they don't want their spell to get countered. So just the threat of Mana Tithe combined with any of our taxing effects makes for a pretty devastating board state because our opponents aren't going to want to cast anything unless they have one additional mana to spare. So as long as we can keep putting tax effects on the board, they might genuinely just never be able to cast anything. So Mana Tithe, God Pharaoh statue, great combination, and just a really nice glimpse into what we're trying to really accomplish with this deck. But that is overall the deck tech itself. The only last major piece of this is that we do have to take a look at the price of the deck, and this week we came incredibly close to our budget limit. We came in at $99.69, so we are only 31 cents under our budget limit. It's kind of surprising how many white tax pieces are incredibly expensive. Now, I will mention that when I first put this deck together, Thalia had not dropped from her reprint in Crimson Vow, so that price was still up there. I hadn't put her in the deck because she was too expensive. She has since dropped, so if you do have a Thalia Guardian of Thraben, she is a good include. But for this deck in particular, our most expensive card is actually a pretty recent one. It's Dranith Magistrate. For the 1 white creature, human wizard, 1/3, your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. This doesn't initially look too powerful, but when you think about how many cards in Commander are cast from places that aren't your hand, it starts to get incredibly powerful. Because not only does this shut off casting cards from the graveyard or casting cards from exile, it shuts off people casting their commanders, which is usually very important to a deck strategy. So being able to stop the commanders, being able to stop exile, graveyard, this shuts off things like adventure, this shuts off things like flashback. This can shut off a lot more than you expect, and while most cards aren't necessarily built around casting spells from other places than their hand, every commander deck, because there is a commander, has at least one card that gets shut off by Dranith Magistrate. So if we can land this early enough or protect it, this can be devastating for some of our opponents, especially if their deck relies very heavily on their commander. So I think it's worth the almost $7 price tag, but if you are looking to cut down on the price, then I would recommend you swap this for Thalia Guardian of Thraben because she's very cheap right now, and she's a great include for the exact same mana cost, 1 and a white. And that should bring the price down closer to $90, not quite down there, but close enough. However, on the other hand, maybe you're looking to increase the price of this deck. And I will be upfront before I get into the 2 cards I have in our out-of-budget upgrades this week. Normally, I shy away from the cards that are staple cards that you kind of try to include in every deck if you can, because that's no fun. I want to focus on the cards that are very specific to what the deck is trying to do. Unfortunately, for this week, the cards that focus very well on what the deck is trying to do are the staple cards. So, for example, the first of which is Esper Sentinel. It's 1 white for a 1/1 artifact creature human soldier. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. This is card draw for mono white, and it's a taxing effect, plus it's an artifact for Oswald. So this is absolutely perfect for what our deck is trying to do, but it's a massive $29.48, so you can kind of see why it wasn't included in the deck, although if you have the budget for it, this is perfect for what the deck's trying to do. It draws your cards and taxes people. What more can you ask for? And then, of course, very similar, we have Smothering Tithe, which is 3 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. Smothering Tithe is currently $38.49, so way too far out of our budget range. But just like Esper Sentinel drawing us cards, Smothering Tithe is going to help us ramp. Again, something that mono white is not super good at, so it deserves a spot in this deck, even though it is a bit of a staple for white decks. And I don't like to include staples. It's again, perfect for what we're trying to do. We want to have mana producing sources that are not our lands. That's where the treasures come in. And it's ramp in mono white, which is incredibly useful. Plus, if we get to the point where we're taxing our opponents enough, they're not going to be able to pay for it anyway. So we will just always have treasures available to us. So if you have a Smothering Tithe and you are looking at building this deck, I highly recommend including it. But for this particular build, it was out of our budget range. And that is our deck tech for the week. The only thing that we should probably do now is see how this deck performs in a game, because it's nice to look at the deck and the deck list and see all the cool synergies, but it's even better to actually play it in a game. So this week, we are going to run it up against Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider, being played by Jason, Anji Falconwrath, being played by Bilal, and Brea Ethereum Shaper, being played by Shawn. So looking at these three commanders, these are a terrifying trio to be facing, but I do think they're a very good trio to test just how much we're going to be able to lock down the board. So Jason's Vorinclex deck is a +1/+1 counter deck. He specifically mentioned he stayed away from Planeswalkers for this deck. So he is going to be making a big board of creatures, swinging at everybody at the table, and hopefully we'll be able to maybe kill his creatures or prevent them from attacking us, and maybe even just stop them from getting counters on them in general. So I'm interested to see how we match up against that. And then next up, we have Bilal's Anji Falconwrath deck, which is not actually a Madness deck. It is a Reanimator deck. So he wants to throw away large creatures into the graveyard and then pull them back out with reanimation spells. Hopefully, again, a card that loses a bit to some of our attacks pieces. It would be nice if we get some of our cards that say activated abilities of creatures can't be activated, or opponent's creatures enter tapped, anything like that to kind of shut down what Anji is doing. So I do think we have a decent chance against that deck as well. Finally, we have Shawn's Brea deck, which is an artifact-centric deck. He wants to play a ton of artifacts, get a ton of value, and hopefully just kind of combo out with one of the many combos that Brea can accomplish. Again, I do think that if we can get the right tax pieces on board, we should be okay. We do have a few cards that care about our opponents having artifacts, things like artifacts coming in tapped, or preventing our opponent's artifacts from activating. So if we can get any of those, I think we can very easily lock Brea out of the game. The trick is going to be surviving long enough to get those cards into play. So I'm very interested to see how this game goes. Like I said, I think this trio of commanders are very terrifying, but it should be a fun game. And let me know what y'all think, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by myself, Bilal, and then Shawn. On Jason's first turn, he plays an Oran Reef the Vastwood and passes. I play a Plains. Bilal plays a Myriad Landscape. Shawn plays a Mystic Monastery. Jason plays a Forest and casts Merfolk Branchwalker, exploring and revealing Loyal Guardian from the top of his deck, putting it into the graveyard and putting a +1/+1 counter on the Merfolk. I play a Plains and cast Arcane Signet. Bilal plays a Dross Forge Bridge. Shawn plays a tapped Sacred Foundry and casts Skull Clamp. Jason plays a Forest and then attacks Shawn for 3, and in his second main phase, casts Yorvo Lord of Garenbrig, which comes in with 4 +1/+1 counters, and gets another one whenever a green creature enters under Jason's control, or gets 2 if that creature has more power than Yorvo. On my turn, I play a Plains, and then cast Kismet, forcing all my opponent's artifacts, creatures, and lands to enter the battlefield tapped. Bilal plays a Lava Claw Reaches. Shawn plays a Hallowed Fountain. Jason plays a Forest, and then casts Pollenbright Druid, putting another counter on Yorvo, and then proliferating when it enters. He then attacks me for 10 with his team, and at this point, he also remembers that he meant to activate Oran Reef in response to Pollenbright's trigger, putting a counter on the Druid and then proliferating it. I play a Buried Ruin. Bilal plays a Graven Cairns. Shawn plays a Plains and then casts Commander's Sphere. Jason plays a War Room and then attacks me for 13. Before blocks though, I flash in Containment Priest, using it to block Yorvo so that I only take 7 damage instead. Then in his second main phase, he decides to cast Karametra's Acolyte. On my turn I play a Plains, and cast Austere Command, choosing to destroy all creatures regardless of their power. Then at the end of turn, Bilal sacrifices his Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Mountain, and then casts his commander, Anji Falconwrath, and also casts Chromatic Lantern, making all his mana tap for any color. Shawn plays a Spectator Seating, and casts his commander, Brea Ethereum Shaper, creating 2 1/1 Thopter tokens when she enters, and after that he casts a tapped Wayfarer's Bauble. On Jason's turn, he just untaps and passes. And at this point, Bilal also realizes that his Mountain would have come into play tapped, so he couldn't have cast his Chromatic Lantern. I play a Plains for turn, and then cast Ugin the Ineffable, making all my colorless spells cost 2 less. And then I activate Ugin's +1 ability to exile the top card of my library and create a 2/2 Spirit token that puts the exiled card into my hand when it dies. Bilal casts Final Parting, searching his library for 2 cards, putting Portraiser into his graveyard and the other into his hand. He then plays a Sun-Scorched Desert, doing 1 damage to me when it enters. Shawn moves straight to combat, attacking Ugin with everything. I block Brea with the Spirit, killing it, putting the exiled card to my hand, and then Ugin takes 2 damage. In his second main phase, he plays a Mountain, and casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. In response, Jason casts Roiling Regrowth, sacrificing a forest to search his library and put 2 basic lands into play tapped. After that, Shawn equips Skull Clamp to a Thopter, giving it +1/-1, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He then repeats this process with the other Thopter, killing it and drawing yet another 2 cards. Jason casts a Jadelight Ranger, exploring twice when it enters. The first one reveals a forest, putting it into Jason's hand, and the second one reveals Cytoplast Rootkin, which Jason puts to the graveyard, and then the Ranger gets a +1/+1 counter. After that he plays a forest and passes. I play a Plains, and cast Approach of the Second Sun, gaining 7 life and putting it 7th from the top in my deck. I then activate Ugin's +1 ability, creating another Spirit, and I also cast Gold Mirror for free thanks to Ugin's neutral ability. At the end of my turn, Bilal activates his commander to discard Chromatic Lantern and draw a card. Then on Bilal's turn, he activates Anji yet again, discarding a Rakdos Guildgate to draw a card. He then casts a Buried Alive, searching his library for 3 creatures and putting them into his graveyard. This has him putting Olivia, Crimson Bride, Worldgorger Dragon, and Falconwrath Aristocrat into his graveyard. Once that resolves, he casts a Dance of the Dead, returning Worldgorger Dragon from the graveyard to play. When it enters, it exiles all of Bilal's permanents until it leaves the battlefield, which it immediately does because Dance of the Dead goes away. Then everything returns, and Bilal can use Dance of the Dead to reanimate the dragon again, repeating this loop an infinite number of times and doing 1 damage to an opponent every time his Sun-Scorched Desert re-enters play. This allows him to infinitely do damage to everyone else at the table, winning Bilal the game. All right, so that was a pretty sweet game. Very unfortunate ending for us. We had the game pretty well locked down. I think we did a pretty decent job of controlling the board, and we had just cast our Approach of the Second Sun, so if we were able to survive just a couple more turns, I think we could have pulled it out, but Bilal was able to go infinite with World Gorger Dragon and kind of knock us all out. He did specifically mention at the end that he was scared about going for it because I had left 1 white mana untapped and I only had 1 card in hand. It was not a Swords to Plowshares or a Path to Exile, unfortunately. If I had had a removal spell, I could have immediately exiled all of Bilal's board because World Gorger Dragon would have gotten rid of everything and he wouldn't have gotten it back, which would have been kind of nice, but we didn't quite get there. We didn't see too much of what Shawn was doing throughout the game. I think that our Kismet at the very beginning really shut him down harder than anticipated. I do think that given more time, he could have probably built his way out of it, but we didn't get to see that, unfortunately. And then Jason was very aggressive very quickly. His build-up really started hitting hard as early as turn 3. So I think that if I didn't have the Austere command when I had it, I believe it probably would have been his game. He probably would have just started knocking us out one by one. So definitely very impressive and very terrifying. And overall, I'm pretty happy with how the deck performed. I know we didn't win, but we did come very close, which is nice to see. So I hope you all enjoyed the game. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. If you have any suggestions for future videos or for future cards that you would like to see, please do leave them in the comments below. Tweet them at us, send them to me on Reddit, anything like that. So hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.